समझ नहीं आ रहा अपने सैलरी इंक्रीमेंट का क्या करूं।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स के एसआईपी का टॉप अप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
क्या? समझ में नहीं आया।
बेटा इतना क्या सोच रहा है? अपने म्यूचुअल फंड्स का एसआईपी टॉपअप करा ले। दिस इज द राइट टाइम।
अब समझा।
Mutual fund investments are subject to market risks. Read all scheme related documents carefully.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Geopolitics with Swasti. I am Sabika Sayyad and with us Dr. Swasti Rao, our consulting editor for strategic and international affairs. I'm so glad we're back. I know you were waiting. We saw all the comments and I'm glad we finally get to take your questions.
Yeah.
Swasti, quite a few detailed questions all over the world. The first is by Senapati. They're referencing POK and the question is, despite our stance on POK, why has our response to the recent killings and tensions been so lackluster? Another following question they have, can the remaining parts of POK be integrated or is our stance merely rhetorical rather than achievable?
Now, it's a good question and also topical because it's natural to rouse curiosity among viewers. Now, quickly with respect to our stand per se and our response, I don't think it's been lackluster per se. I think the MEA did come up, the Indian side did come up with an official condemnation. They're also keeping a very keen eye on the developments in that region. But remember that the restraint there is important to understand and the nuance is also important to understand, Sabika, because, just look at Pakistan. Pakistan is constantly trying to internationalize the Kashmir issue, right? That's what Pakistan does. India, the principal stand of India is that we reject any third-party mediation or third-party interference and so on. Likewise, we also try to sort of, not internationalize such things because then I read a certain nuance, there in India's stand that India has issued a condemnation, but India cannot really copy Pakistan's playbook of sort of, going around talking about it at different forums and internationalizing it, etc. So I don't think it's been lackluster. I see restraint. Perhaps that is a better way of looking at it. Why restraint per se? Because I think restraint is something which is visible generally when we talk about India's response to Pakistan in the last couple of years, especially after Op Sindoor. Now, Op Sindoor did say that every act of terror is going to be an act of war. But even after, that sort of proclamation, if you look at the August 2025 Red Fort attacks, which were sort of thwarted, and also then the very recently a policeman being shot down a couple of days ago in Anantnag, you do see that India, while India's response has been very proportional, India has sort of steered clear of actually taking Pakistan's name too much because, like I said, that I think the main story has to be on India's sort of stability and economic growth at a time when the whole global scenario remains to be very uncertain and Donald Trump keeps coming out with a lot of, I would say, mind-boggling developments every other day, and the war again is back in the Middle East, etc. So, long story short, I see a restraint, not just a nonchalance. Okay,
Right.
that's one. Now, the other part of your question is on can India take back POK or parts of POK? The short answer is no. Why? Because there is a China factor. India's problem with Pakistan on Kashmir also has a China sort of peeping over India and Pakistan, especially on India. How that has happened is because in you remember 1962 when India fought a war with China, and India lost that war to China. Following that war, a part of the Pakistan occupied Kashmir that Pakistan had taken from us in the 47-48 war, in the first war, they ceded part of that to China, and that was the Shaksgam Valley. Now, if you look on the screen and if you look at the map of where Shaksgam Valley is, it is located at a very, very vulnerable, crucial strategic location, which is very close to the Siachen Glacier and the, Karakoram area. And what China has done over the years, since 1963, is that China has developed a lot of military installations and other kind of installations in Shaksgam Valley. So naturally, that is a pressure point which is constantly there on India. It is not about capabilities, it is about the strategic location, and end of the day, anything with regard to POK is definitely going to draw in 3 nuclear armed states. And that is why, for lack of a better term, I just gave you a short answer saying no. Just to give you a little bit of postscript and elaborate on it, let's imagine, hypothetically for a moment, let's imagine that India takes back POK, right? What happens then? It is a very, very untenable situation, because then you are suddenly adding 4.33 million people who are, volatile, radicalized, poor, very, very cut off from Indian mainstream. How are you going to sort of integrate them into the Indian mainstream? I mean, we are having a lot of difficulty with JNK per se. I mean, abrogation of Article 370 and the aftermath, etc. So, a lot of Indian stakes have been invested in stabilizing the JNK question, right? And now we have a front in Ladakh, okay, because the Ladakh question is still unsettled and Sonam Wangchuk's demands are still there. But, just to circle back to POK, so you suddenly have 4.33 million people. You have a huge area. The area, the entire area of the Pakistan occupied Kashmir is about 80,000 square kilometer.
Okay.
While if you compare that to JNK, minus Ladakh, of course, that's about 43,000 square kilometer. So you have a much larger area, so many people, and suddenly then you're left with tackling their question and how do you integrate them. So even hypothetically speaking, let's say if there was, something and some wildcard entry and somehow India was able to still integrate parts of POK or the entire POK, it would still be a very untenable situation. So in my opinion, I do not see any kind of reintegration possible. It is not in India's strategic interest. It is going to sort of lead to a much, much bigger escalation. We will see the entire world community, running over, to this region to control escalation. And finally, I think that even if that were to happen, it would be very untenable. So finally, I think the LOC is going to be regarded as the de facto border between India and Pakistan. India is going to not obviously give up on its claims, on its legal claims, but for everything else, I think it's going to be status quo.
Right, right. Now, the next question is by Narendra Arya. He's asking, what are the hurdles in Balochistan becoming an independent country? A bifurcated, weak Pakistan won't make much of a difference to China, and China can't recognize Balochistan and make friendly relationships with them and easily operate Gwadar port. This will give China a very strong foothold in the region. So what's your take in all of this?
All right. Now, this is a question that is coming from Dhurandharization of Indian politics, right? Let's just put it there. I understand where this is coming from. There is a lot of instability in Balochistan. In fact, the Pakistan-Balochistan problem, let's say that separatism, it has a cyclical nature. So it keeps coming back. And over the course of, the last 1.5 years that we've been doing GPS, actually.
Right.
Now, this Baloch question has been a permanent fixture because every few months, this keeps coming back.
Yeah.
Now, I understand where that question is coming from, but I think we need to tell sort of reality from Dhurandharization. So take it on a lighter note. However, to understand why the integration or the separation of Balochistan as a separate nation is so complicated, you have to look at the map. When you look at the map and you look at how many Baloch people live in what region, you have to understand that it's almost very similar to the Kurds, who are also a transnational group. So both Baloch and Kurds are transnational groups. Coming back to the Baloch people, on your map you can see that the Baloch people live, majority of them of course live in Pakistan. About 60-70% of the entire Baloch population lives in Pakistan. Then many of them live in Iran. Okay, Iran and Pakistan share a 900 kilometer border, and that border is what divides the Baloch people on either side. And then about 2% of Baloch people, or 2 to 5% of Baloch people also live in Afghanistan. So if you are talking about a Baloch nation, then you are hypothesizing a chronic instability in all these three regions simultaneously, so that you're able to have a Baloch nation, right? And that is the problem, because it's being transnational is one problem. The other is that if you look closely at how these Baloch people or populations survive, you should know that these Baloch people, the borders they have, the borders like Pakistan, Iran, Pakistan, Afghanistan, etc., these borders are porous borders.
Right.
And these porous borders are marred by deeply embedded shadow economies. So all kinds of smugglings, right from the banned Russian oil to Russian weapons to Iranian oil, etc., all, and lot of drugs actually, they travel through these porous borders. So there already is a very thriving shadow economy. So when we look at the Baloch people in Pakistan that are a separatist group, perhaps only a very thin slice of that reality comes to fore. A second and another important point related to the Baloch people is that their nature also changes, Sapika. So the Baloch population in Pakistan, they operate more as a separatist group, right? Because that's what they want. I mean, that's what their struggle has been all about. But the same Baloch people, and they are tribal linkages, their family linkages there. The same Baloch people in Iran, they operate more as a radical Sunni group because there they are fighting the Shia government, right? And these groups are also used as pawns by the states themselves. So, long story short, to argue for a Baloch nation or a liberation of, let's say, a Baloch nation would mean a simultaneous destabilization in all these regions, which is not going to happen. At best, what we have is a situation where the Baloch people would continue in this cyclical sort of, bouts of violence against the Pakistani state because they definitely do not identify with the Pakistani state, A. For India, I think it is a good enough scenario. Why? Because it also keeps Pakistan engaged. Remember that the Pakistan-China ambitious CPEC corridor and the Gwadar port is also in the Baloch region, okay? And if you remember, it was the Baloch people that targeted two Chinese engineers and they, sort of killed them and all that. So the Baloch are okay as with respect to a gray zone kind of a destabilization for projects not taking off, etc. But to sort of stretch this logic to the extent of saying that why not just have a Baloch state, that is the problem, because you have to understand the transnational nature of the Baloch people, which is very, very similar to the Kurdish question. And that's why the Kurds are abused by everybody, but they're still not able to have their own state.
Now, the next question is by Nikun Sanghai. He's asking, do you think India's armed forces pension bill and slow procurement process will deter the creation of a healthy pipeline of latest equipment? After all, businesses look for steady income and clarity from the government before taking huge bets.
Wow, a short question, but many layers, all right? So three distinct parts to this question. You want to know about the pension bill. You want to know why the pension bill is so much of a drain on India's defense expenditure, or rather the India's defense budget. Then there is a second part which is to do with procurement process. And here, of course, you want to know about, what part of capital outlay is for procurement. And then the second part is about the process itself. And the third part is about the quantum of orders, right? Where you're talking about the private sector and, how to make it more competitive, etc. And all that. Now, these are three different things and they don't have any direct linkage apart from the fact that they are loosely connected to the question of the India's defense budget. So, as far as the pension part is concerned, I will try to be as sort of objective as possible and try to sort of give you some data and figures for you to understand this better. But as far as pension is concerned, I see where this curiosity comes from, because if you look at the current budget, pension alone sort of constitutes about 22%, right? Which is a lot of money, because our defense budget for 2026-27 stands at about 7.85 lakh crore, okay? So pensions alone are a huge drain, but we need pensions because pensions are a way to attract the best talent in your country. Without pensions, how do you imagine attracting, the real capable people to join the forces, right? If you don't give them pensions, because armed forces and these jobs by definition are definitely very dangerous, right? Compared to any other things that we may be doing. So pension is required, right? You cannot do away with pension. The Agni Veer scheme was in many ways an attempt to try and reduce that load on pension. However, I think the question is not on Agni Veer scheme, so I would probably not spend too much time on it. And also because there already is a lot of not so encouraging feedback on how the Agni Veers have performed on the ground, etc., etc. So let's just understand, yes, pension we do require. Now, as far as procurement is concerned, the second part, it has again two parts. One is that how much money do you have for procurement, which basically means the capital outlay within the defense budget. And second is the process itself. Now, when you look at the money for defense, procurement itself, that is to the tune of about 26 to 27% of total budget. Now, this money, which is definitely an increase from last year, still is not enough when you look at it in proportional terms. And I will just explain this concept to you for a while. But yes, when you look at the defense acquisition per se, we have about 27% of our budgetary allocation for defense devoted to that part. The second part is the process itself. Yes, the process remains extremely painful, painfully long, and several suggestions have been made by way of several defense acquisition procedure upgrades, and the latest one is 2026. So the DAP 2026 also talks about cutting down the bureaucratic hurdles, cutting down the process, the processing time, etc. But understand that by nature, these are extremely sensitive and extremely expensive propositions, and due diligence will be required. So it is, you have to have that perfect balance between making sure that the equipment you need comes on time, and yet some kind of oversight is required. In the case of India, we perhaps, I think we are all very frustrated with the sheer number of years sort of everything takes. So I understand that question well. And third is about sort of creating an ecosystem which is good enough for private businesses. And for that, you have to understand that there's a role of R&D. The government, if you want to really engage your private sector, your startups, and you want them to do R&D, you have to create an ecosystem where you allow them to fail. Because if you don't allow them to fail, you will never be able to allow them to innovate. Innovation does not drop on your head like Apple dropped on Newton's head, right? Innovation is a path of lots of failures, ultimately leading to something which is innovative, etc. So government has to really become very pro R&D, basically creating that space to allow them to fail. Otherwise, there won't be any innovation. Has there been progress made on this accord? I would say yes. Is it satisfactory? I would say it's a work in progress. Now, let's just look at, the numbers that I was telling you about. Now, if you look at the 2026-2027 budget, Sapika, and I've already mentioned that this is 7.85 lakh crore. Now, there are two problems with numbers. First is that this budget, which is clearly an upgrade from last year, is still not 2% of India's GDP. And that is why when you look at budgets and expenditure, you don't have to only look at net numbers, but you have to look at proportional numbers, right? So even though it's an increase, but it's not increased in proportion to India's GDP, it is still 1.9%, not even 2%. So spend more, of course. Please reach at least 2%. Most of the suggestions made after Op Sindoor also said that you need to spend much, much more on defense. One. Second is that within the 7.85 lakh crore, I already told you that about 22% goes to pension. Only 27.95 or 28% is allocated for capital expenditure, which means for buying new equipment. The rest, which is 72%, is for everything else. So pay, pension, operational cost, etc., etc. And I told you pensions alone, it's about 22%. R&D is very low, about 3 to 5%, which goes to DRDO. And of course, we are suffering from a chronic problem of, low R&D. But coming back, why I told you these figures is because if you compare these figures, it gives you a certain ratio. Now, the ratio of capital outlay, which is almost 28%, and defense services revenue, which is the other part. Now, if you look at this ratio, it is 28:72, which means 28% for defense acquisition, for new acquisition, and 72% for everything else. Now, this 28:72, the ratio is basically something that this parliamentary committee, the Standing Parliamentary Committee on Defense, has been underscoring and saying that this is low. The ideal ratio should be about 40:60, which means 40% of your total defense budget should go for procurement, considering the kind of problems and the challenges that India has, considering the way, wars have changed, considering the fact that we have so much backlog to clear, etc. So 40% of the total defense budget should go in capital procurement, and only 60% should go to everything else, right? This is something which has been recommended. Now, again, like I said, that this is something that nobody can achieve overnight, but this is a work in progress. However, just one more thing I'd like to mention here is that when you look at this, capital outlay within the defense budget figure, counterintuitively, it has been lowest in NDA regimes. It's been the lowest in NDA governments. So the highest were in the UPA government, but in the 3 terms of the Modi government, you see that the capital outlay, that ratio within the larger defense budget, right, has been lowest. Okay. Now there can be multiple, and again, don't confuse, there has been an increase, but in terms of proportionality, it has been low. That is why you need to understand numbers better. These are three different things, but at the same time, they are still connected. But I just gave you all this elaboration to help you understand the complexity and what really we should be doing. So not just looking at more numbers, but also more proportional numbers.
Now, Swasti, the next question is by Bharat, that is India. They're referencing the Russia-Ukraine war. They're asking what the updates are, what's happening there. Is Ukraine gaining some land or is dominant in the war?
Okay, now it's an interesting time to actually discuss Russia-Ukraine war that we've been discussing for the last 5 years again. But again, this is an interesting time. Why? Because a lot of action is happening, really, a lot of action, and it's just sort of intensifying, really, every day almost. Now, in terms of where Russia is, okay, the larger questions remain unresolved, okay. Russia is still stuck at the 19-20% of Ukrainian land that they held previously. Particularly 2026 was very bad. Their advance was very, very slow. In fact, they could barely advance and Ukraine still took back some of its territory. Again, it does not change much in the bigger picture because if you look at in terms of larger Ukrainian territory, it's still about 19 to 20%, right? So 600 square kilometer here or 500 square kilometer there does not really mean much. However, what really means is how the war is intensifying. So even if the battlefront particularly remains rather stuck, right? But where the war is intensifying is Ukraine's ability to really reach out anywhere they want in Russia. So I think for months now, Ukraine has been sort of targeting the oil refinery, so much so that India now started exporting oil, refined oil back to Russia. But so coming back, so Ukraine has been gaining these abilities and capabilities to deep strike into Russia. So from the heart of Moscow to as far away as Siberia to St. Petersburg, I mean, they can hit wherever they want. That's one that has really made the Russian energy side very vulnerable, and we have seen a lot of coverage in international media over that. Second is that I think recently there's also been a little switch in Ukraine strategy, because for the longest time they were targeting oil refineries and military inventories and warehouses. Now only today, or late last night, they targeted wild berries. Wild berries is basically Russia's Amazon, and they targeted one of the biggest centers of wild berry in the heart of St. Petersburg. Okay. And St. Petersburg is important not only because it's it's in Kaliningrad and it's in that very, very strategic location, in Europe, but also because that is where Putin is from. So I think those things sort of make Russia really very vulnerable. Now, again, this is not to say that Ukraine is not vulnerable. Ukraine obviously has been destroyed much more. Ukraine has been on the receiving side of most of the destruction. However, recently there was also a lot of political scandal in Ukraine because the Ukrainian defense minister, who was barely 34 years old when he became defense minister, so that was anyway unprecedented. So Mikhailo Fedorov was, he was devastatingly popular, and he was also credited with Ukraine's success with drones, with data, with AI. And it was just, everybody was just basically talking about this very young chap who has just come and just completely changed the rules of the game, and all to Ukraine's advantage. Now, this young chap who was the defense minister got into a, kind of a tussle, let's say an ego tussle or whatever tussle, at least that's what the newspapers tell us, with the commander-in-chief, whose name is Alexander Syrskyi. And General Alexander Syrskyi is like, an old-style Soviet-era kind of a general. He was very instrumental in protecting Kyiv when Russia first laid siege on Kyiv in the initial days of the war. So cutting a long story short, first Zelensky had a lot of pressure, and he landed up asking Fedorov to resign. People just took to streets. Thousands of people took to streets because I told you that he was devastatingly popular. And then eventually Zelensky had to fire the commander-in-chief. So now he has a new commander-in-chief and he has a new defense minister. He understands that Fedorov is very, very popular among people, and he has offered Fedorov to join the government back. Fedorov so far has not really shown any willingness to take the offer that Zelensky is giving him, because he wants to become, either a defense minister or something, something equivalent. Now, long story short, this basically shows that when a country that is anyway under war and under so much duress, this kind of a political scandal obviously is the worst time, to have. Now, on the military front, I already told you that Kyiv again is having a bad time, because just as Kyiv is hurting Russia. Russia's strike on civilians and Russia's strikes on Kyiv have also been intensifying. In fact, just a few days ago, Russia struck in Odessa port, which is in the Black Sea region. Russia struck a ship, and 4 Indian seafarers got killed. Okay, and which is, I mean, no matter who's fighting whom, but Indian seafarers tend to get killed because there are so many Indian seafarers on these ships. So anyway, so that basically means to show that the war is intensifying. I have to tell you a little bit about economic indicators,
Right.
because economic indicators also don't show a very good picture. Now, as far as Russia is concerned, okay, for Ukraine, understand that Ukraine's economy is completely dependent on what Europeans are supporting it with. Okay, so Ukraine's sort of ability to stay afloat and do all this basically depends on, to what extent Europeans are going on supporting Ukraine. So that's very, very clear. So as long as Europe supports Ukraine, Ukraine stays afloat. And obviously, the Ukrainian innovation has a very, very important role to play, because they have absolutely changed the rules of the engagement also. And today, it's only Ukraine that has the ability to really fight a 21st century high-tech war.
Yeah.
And that's what been the learning from the Middle Eastern situation as well. But for Russia, the economic indicators are also not good. Why? Because Russia is already in a war economy. About 46% of its federal budget goes to military spending. So it is in a feverish military spending. And most of the markers say that the military spending has become so central to Russian economic and industrial, so to say, activity, that they cannot really afford it not to work. Okay, because that is where the entire focus is. So if tomorrow the war were to end, what is going to happen to all this spending, and what is going to happen to all this activity? And that also raises questions why Europeans are worried that Russia might attack somewhere else, when we'll come to that later. But I think that humongous amount of military spending, where I just told you the federal budget, and if you look at it in terms of its GDP, it's almost 10% of Russia's GDP, which is really huge. There's one question that I get asked a lot of times about Russia's financial bandwidth, and the logic is that Russia was definitely having a lot of challenges, and Russian economy was not really doing very well. I told you about Elvira Nebulina, who was the head of Russia's central bank, and who basically went on public, all right, criticizing all the economic pressures building up. However, the fact that because of the Middle East war and the pressure on the Strait of Hormuz, the Russian energy was back in the market, right? And Russian energy and Russian oil and gas was being, bought by everybody, including by India. So that must have really sort of given a new lease of life, economic life for Russia. Now, that was interesting, and you have to look up the numbers again. So if you look at the numbers are again interesting, because all the earning that Russia had from oil and gas exports because of Hormuz, that only led to federal budget revenues being upped by 0.3%, while expenditures in the same period went up by 17%, right? And that is the reason why the pressure is still intact. And this data that I'm telling you, I looked up a Turkish outlet, because Turkey is supposed to be a very neutral player when it comes to Russia, Ukraine. They have genuine interest with Russia, and they are also supporting Ukraine. So they're definitely more neutral when it compared to other European countries. So this period is January to May of 2026, and this data was updated in June 2026, which is that with the revenue earned for 0.3%, there is a expenditure for 17%, and that is what keeps the pressure on. So long and short, I already told you the ground situation is still static, but the war is becoming very untenable. Ukraine's strategy is to pressurize Russia into negotiation, where Ukraine can have some more leverage. So it is about gaining more relative leverage than to really take back its territory, because they can't do it, even if they were able to sort of isolate Crimea, that they're doing very successfully as of now. The only, I think, bad news for Ukraine, apart from the political scandal, is that yes, human resource is a major problem for them. And second, I was just recently reading some voting patterns of European countries with regard to supporting Ukraine. That solidarity has to be maintained for Ukraine, because not all 27 European Union member states share the same view, and they are very fed up of the war. So not everybody wants to continue supporting Ukraine. Yeah.
Right. Now, the next question is also on the Ukraine-Russia theater. This question is by Ume. They're asking, how do we see the Russian strategy evolving vis-a-vis NATO in the near future, say in the next 3 to 6 months? There are a lot of influencing factors progress in Ukraine, the midterm elections in the US, Trump, Europe defense spending. They're also wondering if there's a China factor in all of this.
Right. So, well, I mean, the most important thing for Russia, I mean, the most important thing for Putin is to win the war because he has not really planned for an exit strategy otherwise. He doesn't have a plan B. There
Yeah.
is only plan A. And this is Putin's war. It has not really helped Russia, but this is Putin's war. Now, in terms of what really is its Russia's strategy, now, one, I already mentioned that Russia is spending huge amounts of money on its war economy, all right? And it's pretty much locked its domestic industry into a permanent state of high tempo production. And all that high tempo production is basically military capabilities, right? So, the question is, what is going to happen to all this production once the war in Ukraine ends? So naturally, Russia will probably have to start a war elsewhere. And that's what the European assessment is, that Russia looks very poised to start another war on the Baltic countries, because that's one vulnerability. If you look at the map, you can see the Baltic countries, how small they are, Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia, and how close they are to Russia's, the eastern flank, right? I mean, the Russia-NATO border. So I think that's one. The second is that there are also assessments that Moscow is already rebuilding and expanding its conventional military forces along the western borders. So I think Russians have also, see, the Russians have the capability, right? Even though they have these challenges, but yet they have been able to divert some capabilities
Yeah.
into localized production and stuff like that. So you can't just write it off like that. Now, as far as Russia's strategy to NATO is concerned, I see it has already been operating in the gray zone because for many years now, Russia is not really looking at a conventional conflict with the NATO states because of the fear of Article 5 and collective security and all that. But they have always been operating below the threshold of conventional war, right? Only so much so that it keeps the NATO countries, and especially on the eastern flank, destabilized. So it is about attacking undersea cables. It is about attacking power grids. It is about attacking critical infrastructure and so on. So all these things have been happening. So critical infrastructure sabotage, cyber attacks, electronic jamming, interference, disinformation, all of these have been happening from Russia's side very, very actively,
Okay.
not only because of the Russia-Ukraine war, but as a systemic, or I would say as a long-drawn strategy towards destabilizing the NATO's eastern flank
Okay.
for a while now, right? Because they want to do everything short of conventional war. And in today's times, you know that this is enough to keep the entire region destabilized. So I think when you ask me what is Russia's strategy, the strategy towards NATO is definitely full exploitation of the gray zone. We already see a lot of examples for that. The second is basically also on a political level, exploiting the transatlantic rupture to the extent possible. So the Donald Trump coming to office and undermining European interests. So you always see the Russian disinformation handles and social media handles like really trying to capitalize on that, encouraging and cultivating the European far right, because that has a very, very different view on European integration and they are very Eurosceptic. So I think at the political level, Russia is doing a lot of things. For NATO, gray zone level, they're doing a lot of things. But also there is a possibility of a conventional sort of a militarized conflict because of Russia's war economy, and that is something I alluded to in the first set of remarks. However, remember that for any of this to work, the first thing that Putin has to do is to really finish the war.
Okay.
And finishing the war is not easy because I told you that Russian rate of advancement has been painfully slow. And by and large, that hasn't changed. They are still struggling to get breach the fortress belt. The town called Konstantinivka has still not completely fallen to Russia, and basically a very bloody, kill zone sort of continues. And this is what probably I would have to say to this question.
Swasti, this episode's last question is by Surbhi. She's asking, can Latin American nations from a unified economic bloc similar to Mercosur to bypass US sanctions and dollar dominance? Asking this with respect to heavily sanctioned nations like Cuba. Can regional solidarity realistically override US economic pressure?
Now, Well, I mean, theoretically speaking, yes, there are such blocs. They do form regional blocs like Community of Latin American and Caribbean States. This is like a 33-member bloc. Similarly, there is something called, and this bloc was also created basically to have more autonomy away from United States and Canada. So this particular bloc was founded in 2004 by Venezuela and Cuba. Remember that during Maduro years, until the Maduro years, Cuba and Venezuela were very, very tightly entwined. And all of this was basically to sort of promote solidarity, defy US hegemony, etc. Now, this is how it looks on the paper. In reality, things do not work. Why? Because US is the biggest, trading partner for all of these countries. Now, Latin American countries are not, they are not entwined in economic relations among themselves. Okay, their biggest economic partner, their biggest trading partner is the United States.
Right.
All right. So that is one vulnerability that they have that sort of comes in the way of them forming a bloc against the United States, right? That's one. Second is that the other thing is that, recently there has been a blue wave in Latin America. Now, why the color blue? Because just to basically differentiate from the color pink, because there was time when most of the Latin American countries, Central American countries were all sort of socialist, governments, right from the other end of the extremes like Nicaragua, Cuba, Venezuela, to more moderate, for example, Mexico, Brazil, etc. So there was a time when everybody, even Argentina, etc. And lately what we have seen is that there's this onslaught of return of conservative governments, the blue wave. And frankly, right now, it's just Cuba and Nicaragua that are really sort of uh, like are outliers, and everybody else, whether or not conservative or socialist, I mean, whether or not of either of these two categories, they still are extremely dependent on US when it comes to trade. And the classic example here is Mexico, because Sheinbaum's government is socialist, however, is leftist. However, I mean, the economic integration with America is really, really deep. Now, what it means is that because of deep economic integration with the US, separately and not as a bloc, their leverage to act as a group obviously diminishes. And the second is that these so-called like long-standing socialist regimes, which were obviously so hollowed out, and that's why they started falling one after the other, they were also characterized by a deep-rooted institutional weakness that never really allowed the institutions to to be formed, to thrive, a rule of law to perpetuate, etc. And these two factors together, so the trading relations with the US and weak institutional scenarios, both these things together, they basically hindered a deep economic integration. So there were organizations on paper, but they definitely don't have the leverage. Okay. And lastly, I can just say that, of course, there are attempts with the Mercosur bloc. Mercosur is with Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. Originally, there was also Venezuela, but Venezuela's membership was suspended. Now, again, with Maduro gone, because remember, Brazil has been very, very critical of Maduro. In fact, I keep telling everybody that please don't look things. I keep telling everybody that don't take things on face value. Brazil was the one that blocked Venezuela's entry into BRICS. Okay, so that is the level of disruption they have between the leaders. However, with now Maduro gone and practically Venezuela being run by Marco Rubio via Delcy Rodriguez, I think there would be a case very soon to sort of get Venezuela back into Mercosur, but not right now, because Mercosur, as you know, that they're already negotiating a free trade agreement with the EU, so they can't be changing things radically right away. But those are the reasons why they are not able to form regional blocs with enough leverage to sort of stand up to the United States, because they are way, way, way too entwined with the United States.
Right. Right. Thank you so much, Swasti. That brings us to the end of our episode. We'll be back again next week with another episode of Geopolitics with Swasti.
And hopefully on time.
Hopefully on time.